How are you guys doing? Today is Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an elite individual profile on Harrison Smith. The elite starting safety for the Minnesota Vikings turns 33 today, and my intention with this episode is, of course, to provide some focus and take a zoom in and look at Harrison Smith's impact on the game of football on a micro level, game in and game out, what he's done season in, season out for his team. And of course, I'm going to zoom out and look at his macro impact and how he as an individual player on an 11-man lineup on the field has been making such a great impact on the Minnesota Vikings franchise and even the NFC North division as a whole. But of course, if you're unfamiliar with Harrison Smith, he stands at about 6'2". He's 214 pounds. The best way to describe his game is just he's a very hard hitter, and he's also very smart. He definitely knows what he's doing, very ruthless. And of course, he's a very good leader on the defensive side. And I think that's probably his most underrated attribute, is that he's been one of the constants on a very solid and what's been a very dominant Minnesota Vikings defense for the decade that he's been there. And then, of course, I think that just going into it would just show what his impact has been as being a captain for a very solid defensive unit. So Harrison Smith is originally from Augusta, Georgia. I guess that's where he was born. He would go on to play high school football in Tennessee, and out of collegiate athletes in the area, he would establish himself as a 4-star out of high school. 4-star meaning that he was expected to have an impact on the collegiate level his sophomore season. That's kind of what the star system means. And he would go on to get recruited to play football for 4 years at Notre Dame. He was originally recruited by Charlie Weis, and Brian Kelly would become the coach while Harrison Smith was at Notre Dame. Harrison Smith's first season, or I guess his original freshman season, he would be redshirted. So his redshirt freshman season would be in 2008, where he actually began his career at linebacker. In his freshman season in 2008, he would start 13 games for a Notre Dame team that would go on to finish with a 7-6 record. They went on to win the Hawaii Bowl. They beat Hawaii that year. But in that season, Harrison Smith would finish with about 57 tackles. He even had 3.5 sacks and 8.5 tackles for loss. His 3.5 sacks are the only sacks that he's registered in his collegiate football career, and his 8.5 tackles for loss are the most that he's had. In his redshirt sophomore season in 2009, he would go on to start 12 games in a season in which Notre Dame will go on to finish with a 6-6 record. They failed to make a bowl game. That was Charlie Weis's last season, and the next year he would be replaced by Brian Kelly. In Harrison Smith's sophomore season, where he would eventually get to start a couple of games at strong safety and then strong side linebacker, he would finish with he would play 12 games, and he would finish with 69 total tackles, 12 more than the previous season. He also had 6.5 tackles for losses. He would also go on to force his very first fumble in college, as, like I said, Notre Dame would fail to make the bowl game. His redshirt junior season would be in 2010. This would be Harrison Smith's age 21 season, and in this season he would play 13 games for a Notre Dame team that would finish with an 8-5 record, and Brian Kelly's first season there. They would go all the way to the Sun Bowl, where they would beat Miami 33-17. They won this matchup by 6. In his third season, Harrison Smith would eventually go on to start at strong safety. And because this was technically his senior season, even though he was a redshirt sophomore, this was his third of 4 years of eligibility. And in this year, he would play, in the 13 games he played, he finished with 19 total tackles. He had half a tackle for loss, and he had all 7 of his collegiate interceptions come in 2010. And those were all 7 of the passes he defended, as he would go on to be recognized as one of the better DBs in football. Following that, as a graduate senior, he would come back and return to play at Notre Dame. And in his final season with Notre Dame, which would go down as his graduate senior season, his 4th season actually playing, he played 13 games for a Notre Dame team that would finish with an 8-5 record, just like they had the year before. They would go all the way to the Champs Sports Bowl before losing to Florida State in the final. In the season, in the 13 games he played, Harrison Smith would finish with 90 tackles, which is right about what he did before. He would go on to finish with 3 tackles for losses. He even defended 9 passes. He forced a career-high 2 fumbles, and he also recovered his only fumble in all of college. Following his 4 years at Notre Dame, Smith would establish himself as a good enough prospect to be taken with the 29th overall pick in the 2012 NFL Draft. Looking at that draft, this is the draft where Andrew Luck was taken first overall by Stanford to go to the Indianapolis Colts. Looking at other players that are amongst the elite in this list, Fletcher Cox was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles out of Mississippi State with the 12th pick. And just taking a look, Harrison Smith was actually the second safety picked. The first safety picked in his draft was Mark Barron, drafted by Tampa Bay Buccaneers out of Alabama. But of course, Harrison Smith would establish himself as one of the best safeties in college football prior to getting drafted. And he was drafted to the Minnesota Vikings, where he's played his entire NFL career, at least to date. His first season with Minnesota would be his age 23 season in 2012. In that season, he would start all 16 of the games he played in a season where the Vikings would finish with a 10-6 record. They won 7 more games than the previous season in Leslie Flip Frazier's second season. This is also the season where Adrian Peterson would come back to win the MVP. No Vikings player has won the Offensive Player of the Year or the MVP since 2012. But in Harrison Smith's rookie year, he would start all 16 of those games. He finished with 104 tackles, which to this day is the second most tackles he's ever put together in a season. He even had a tackle for loss. He would finish with a sack, also a forced fumble, and a fumble recovery. He would go on to defend 10 passes, as he also had 3 interceptions and 2 pick sixes in his rookie season. Once the Vikings would make the playoffs, they would go on to lose in the wild card round to their divisional rivals, the Green Bay Packers. But of course, following the season, Harrison Smith was already named to at least the all-rookie team, being recognized as a player that had earned his spot in that Minnesota Vikings roster already as a rookie. Very tough thing to do. His second season would be his age 24 season in 2013. In his age 24 season, he would start 7 of the 8 games he played in a season where the Vikings finished with a 5-10-1 record. They won 5 less games than the prior season, and that was Leslie Frazier's final season there. He would play half the games after he was placed on injury reserve after he had a left foot injury. However, out of the 8 games Harrison Smith would play, he would go on to finish with 58 tackles on the season, which was on pace to do better than what he did the previous season. He also would go on to recover a fumble, and not to mention he also finished with 2 interceptions in half of a season. Even though the Vikings missed the playoffs, Harrison Smith was still a much-needed player for them at that time. Transitioning into his third season with the Vikings, his age 25 season came in 2014, and he would go on to start all 16 games in a season where the Vikings would go on to finish with a 7-9 record. They won 2 more games than the previous season, and this was Mike Zimmer's first season coaching, and Mike Zimmer has been the coach every season since then. In his very first season with Mike Zimmer, Harrison Smith would finish with 92 tackles on the season. He would get a then career high 7 tackles for loss. He would go on to force a fumble. He would finish with 3 sacks on the year, which is tied for the most sacks he's ever had in a season. He would go on to finish with 5 interceptions, which is tied for the most interceptions he's had in a season. And he would also go on to finish with a pick 6 out of one of those 5. In his first 3 years in the league, he already had 10 interceptions, even though he wasn't necessarily a Pro Bowler and the Vikings were making the playoffs. He was a consistently amazing player for the Minnesota Vikings. And once they started making those playoff runs, then you kind of started to see, and even the NBA started to kind of see his value differently at the safety position. His 4th season with the Vikings was his age 26 season in 2015. And in that season, he would start all 13 of the games he played in a season where the Minnesota Vikings would finish with an 11-5 record. They won 4 more games than the previous season, and they would go on to win the AFC North for the very first time in Harrison Smith's career. In that season, in the 13 games he played, he would go on to finish with 66 tackles. He would go on to finish with a sack and a half. He had 2 interceptions. One of them was returned for a touchdown. And he would also go on to force a fumble. And while doing all this and helping the Minnesota Vikings make the playoffs, Harrison Smith was named to the Pro Bowl for the very first time in his NFL career in 2015. And in addition to being named a Pro Bowler for the very first time, once the Vikings made the playoffs, they would end up losing in the wild card round to the Seattle Seahawks, who that year would go would go on and lose to the Panthers, and then the Denver Broncos would be the team that won Super Bowl 50 that year. Following Harrison Smith's first Pro Bowl season, his fifth season with the Minnesota Vikings would be his age 27 season in 2016. In that season, he would start all 14 of the games he played in a season where the Vikings would finish with an 8-8 record in Mike Zimmer's third season coaching the team. Smith would go on to be named an All-Star for the second year in a row as he had 91 tackles on the season. He would finish with 4 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. He would finish with two fumble recoveries, which is tied for the most he's had in a season. And like I said, he would continue on with what he was doing the previous year. And after being named to the Pro Bowl for the second year in a row, the Vikings would miss the playoffs and now would transition into his third straight year as a Pro Bowler. In his 6th year with the Minnesota Vikings in 2017, in his age 28 season, he would start all 16 of the games he played in a season where the Minnesota Vikings would finish with a 13-3 record. They would win the NFC North again. They actually have not won the NFC North since 2017. In Harrison Smith's 6th season with the team, he will go on to start all 16 games for that team. And while they won the NFC North for the very lone time in his career, Harrison Smith would be named to the first team All-Pro at the safety position. He would finish with 78 tackles, which is about par with what he was doing at the time. He had a sack and a half. He had 7 tackles for loss, which at that point was tied for the most he'd ever had that season. He would go on to defend 12 passes as he had 5 interceptions on the year. This would tie his career high, and while helping the Vikings finish with even though he helped the Minnesota Vikings finish near the top of the playoff standings and finishing at the top of their division, he would be named to, like I said, the first team. He was named to the Pro Bowl, and he was also 4th in defensive player of the year voting, in a vote that would see Aaron Donald of the Los Angeles Rams take home the title. Following that 2017 season, the Vikings would end up beating the Saints off of some playoff magic in the divisional round, and then they would end up losing in the NFC Conference Championships to the eventual Super Bowl champ Philadelphia Eagles when they were led by Nick Foles. Following Harrison Smith's lone first-team All-NFL season, he would return for his 7th season with the Minnesota Vikings in his age 29 season in 2018. He would go on to start all 16 games that he would play in a season where the Vikings finished with an 8-7-1 record. In this season, Harrison Smith would be named a Pro Bowler for the 4th year in a row as he finished with 84 tackles. He finished with a career-high 3 sacks, tied for the most in his career. He also finished with a career-high 9 tackles for loss. To this day, he still has not had more than that. He will go on to force a fumble and recover 2 fumbles. This is the 2nd year in a row he recovered 2 fumbles. He will go on to finish with 3 interceptions, making it the 6th year out of his first 7 that he would finish with multiple interceptions in a season. And even then, once the season finished, the Vikings would not make the playoffs, but he would go on to make the Pro Bowl. And in 2018, he would make the 2nd team All-Pro for the lone time that he had made it in his NFL career. He had made 2 different All-Pro teams, proving that the first time he had made it was not necessary. It was definitely was not a fluke. This would transition into Harrison Smith's 8th season with the Minnesota Vikings. In his age 30 season with the Vikings in 2019, he will go on to start all 15 of the games he played in a season where the Vikings finished with a 10-6 record. They finished with the 2nd best record in the NFC North as they had clinched the playoffs. 2019 was the last time that the Minnesota Vikings as a franchise have clinched the playoffs. Harrison Smith would start all 15 of the games he played, and in those games he finished with 85 tackles. He would finish with 4 tackles for loss, not to mention that he also would finish with a sack. He finished with 3 forced fumbles, the most forced fumbles he would ever force in his career. He would also recover 2 fumbles for the 3rd year in a row. He would finish with 3 interceptions, making it the 7th time in his first 8 years, in which he finished with more than two, or with at least two interceptions in a season. And at the conclusion of the year, the Minnesota Vikings made the playoffs following Harrison Smith making the Pro Bowl. They would end up beating the Saints in overtime off of a touchdown, off some more playoff magic. And then they would end up losing in the divisional round to the San Francisco 49ers, who went all the way to the Super Bowl to lose to the Kansas City Chiefs in Super Bowl 54. That would transition, of course, into this most recent season that Harrison Smith has played with the Vikings. In his 9th season with the franchise, in his age 31 season, he would start all 16 of the games he played in a season where the Minnesota Vikings would finish with a 7-9 record. They had missed the playoffs in what would be the NFL's final season of playing 16 games. In those 16 games, he would finish with 89 tackles on the season. He finished with half a sack, 10 passes defended, and even had 5 interceptions, which is tied with his career high. Despite tying his career high in interceptions in the Minnesota Vikings not making the playoffs, Harrison Smith would miss the Pro Bowl for the first time since 2014, ending his 5-year stretch of consistently making the playoffs, but he was still putting up incredible numbers. And at the conclusion of the season, the Minnesota Vikings, of course, had to regroup and come back for next season. And this leads us into this most recent season that Harrison Smith has played to finish out his first full decade with the Minnesota Vikings. This most recent season in 2021 was his age 32 season. And in that season, he would go on to start all 15 of the games he played in a season where the Vikings finished with an 8-9 record. They missed the playoffs for the second year in a row. He will go on to make the Pro Bowl for the 6th time in the last 7 years at the safety position. In the 15 games he played, he finished with a career-high 114 tackles for a team that didn't make the playoffs, but they were still an incredible unit with him there. He would go on to finish with 3 sacks, which is tied for the team for his career high. He's done so 2 other times in his career. He would defend 7 passes as he even forced a fumble. And he would also finish with an interception on the day as well. And taking a look at where this leads Harrison Smith right now. As of right now, Harrison Smith is turning 33. After he's made 6 of the last 7 Pro Bowls, I think it would be a crime to not consider him one of the elite defensive players in this game today, as he is really showing what it takes to be a very valuable safety. Because yes, you have to be incredibly talented. Yes, you have to be incredibly insightful and very smart. But of course, you also have to be a very good team leader. And for a lot of teams, like, if you have a very strong safety leading your unit, it may mean you have a very solid unit. A lot of the teams that have really solid safeties tend to be very good. And I think that moving forward, the Minnesota Vikings, with a couple right moves, can definitely do right by Harrison Smith. Or if Harrison Smith were to go somewhere else, I imagine that his impact most definitely would follow him wherever he goes, because he's that good at the position. Thanks once again for listening to all 17, 18 minutes of this piece. I really do hope all is well. I want to thank the ESPN, NFL, Pro Football, College Football, the reference websites. I want to thank of course, even the NCAA, Notre Dame websites for giving me all the facts and figures that I need, because without them, I wouldn't be able to do this. Once today's exhibition matchups are over, I will come back tomorrow on Thursday, February 3rd for another episode of The Elite. And until then, I want to thank everyone once again for listening to this piece. I hope all is well. And if you ever get a chance to watch Harrison Smith, I would. He's wearing number 22 for the Minnesota Vikings. And until then, thanks for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and peace out. I'll catch you with more tomorrow.